The emergence of Lagash as one of humanity's earliest true cities represents a crucial chapter in the long transition from scattered village life to organized urban settlement. Situated in the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, approximately 25 kilometers east of the great watercourse of the Euphrates, Lagash occupied a geographic position that would shape its destiny as a hub of agriculture, worship, and governance. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the land that cradled Lagash was part of the larger Sumerian heartland, a wide and level plain carved and nourished by the unpredictable flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Over countless centuries, these rivers shifted their beds, flooding here, retreating there, and leaving behind fresh deposits of dark, silty soil. This process gradually built up one of the most agriculturally fertile landscapes of the ancient world. The people who would one day call Lagash home inherited this environment. The regular flooding cycles brought both challenges and blessings, while sudden inundations could damage settlements and sweep away fragile structures of reed and clay. The water also deposited nutrient-rich layers that renewed the soil each year. This cycle created the possibility for sustained barley cultivation, one of the staples of the Sumerian diet. Fields of barley, watered through carefully dug irrigation channels, stretched across the plains, forming the agricultural backbone that would support the city's eventual rise. The flat topography of the alluvial plain made irrigation both necessary and feasible. Early settlers carved canals that carried water from the shifting river branches into fields and storage basins. These canals required careful maintenance. Too little water, and crops would fail. Too much, and the land could become salinated. And barren communities, therefore, had to cooperate closely, organizing labor for digging, dredging, and monitoring. This collective work not only sustained life, but also laid the groundwork for more structured forms of governance. Abundant clay, drawn from riverbanks, provided the essential building material for the people of Lagash in the absence of stone or timber in large quantities. Clay was shaped into sun-dried bricks that formed the walls of homes, storage facilities, and temples. The same clay served another revolutionary purpose. It became the medium for writing. With stylus pressed into damp tablets, Lagash's inhabitants recorded contracts, offerings, and administrative decisions, creating a written record that endures. Thousands of years later, Lagash also lay along minor trade arteries that connected the interior of Mesopotamia to the wider region. While it did not command the extensive trade routes of larger centers like Uruk, its position still allowed it to serve as a node in the exchange of goods and ideas. Merchants could bring in metals from the east, timber from distant lands, and precious stones from the Iranian plateau. In return, Lagash exported agricultural surplus, woven textiles, and crafted goods. These interactions slowly introduced cultural influences that enriched the city's development. The earliest traces of Lagash are archaeological rather than literary. Excavations at sites such as Tel al-Hiba, identified as ancient Lagash, reveal layers of mud brick foundations, pottery, fragments, and administrative tablets. These remains tell the story of a settlement that expanded steadily during the early dynastic period of Sumerian history. Roughly around 2500 BCE by this time, Lagash had grown from a modest agricultural village into a regional power, presided over by rulers who called themselves ensi, or city governors, but before kings and dynasties. Lagash was simply a collection of households bound together by necessity. Families rose at dawn to tend their fields. Herds of goats and sheep grazed along the canals. Fishermen cast nets into the waterways, drawing up fish that supplemented the grain-based diet. Women ground barley into flour, baked bread in clay ovens, and brewed beer, a staple beverage in Sumerian society. Children gathered reeds, shaped clay toys, and helped their parents in daily chores. Life was simple in rhythm, yet demanding in effort. Tied to the cycles of water and earth, the heart of these early communities was often the temple. Even before Lagash became a political capital, it was a religious center. The main deity associated with the city was Ningirsu, a warrior god and patron of agriculture. Temples dedicated to Ningirsu rose on mud-brick platforms, serving not only as places of worship, but also as administrative hubs where offerings were collected, land was managed, and workers were assigned to tasks. In this way, the sacred and the practical merged. Religion provided the justification for labor and authority, while the temple economy organized the resources that sustained the population as generations passed. The settlement's reliance on cooperative irrigation, temple management, and trade laid the foundation for more complex political structures. Small village councils gave way to centralized leadership. Leaders gained authority not only as organizers of labor, but also as representatives of divine will. The Ensi of Lagash was seen as the steward of the city's gods, ruling in their name and protecting the land through both ritual and military action. In this early stage, Lagash was not yet the sprawling metropolis it would later become, but its character was already forming. The interaction of fertile land, irrigation systems, clay resources, modest trade connections, and organized religion shaped it into a distinct community. From these quiet beginnings would rise one of the most significant Sumerian city-states, whose kings carved their names into stone and whose conflicts with neighbors were etched into history. For now, though in the calm of the early 3rd millennium BC, Lagash was a city still in the making. Its fields rustled with grain, its canals carried the slow current of diverted rivers. Smoke curled from household hearths and temple courtyards filled with offerings of bread and beer. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, and the destiny of Lagash, though not yet visible, was already being written in clay. When Lagash began to move from a loose collection of villages into a more organized city-state, it did so under the guiding presence of its temples. At the heart of the city stood the great sanctuary of Ningirsu, the warrior god who embodied both agriculture and protection. Around this sacred complex, life in Lagash steadily arranged itself, drawing people into a system that combined worship, governance, and labor. The temple was more than a place for prayer. It was the center of economic life. Fields were measured and allotted in the name of the god. Herds of sheep grazed under temple supervision. Weaving workshops produced cloth, while storage rooms kept jars of barley and oil. Every offering made to the gods, whether a basket of dates, a jug of beer, or a goat from a herdsman, was carefully recorded by scribes on clay tablets. These records did not serve personal bookkeeping, but rather the divine household. In this way, the temple of Ningirsu functioned as both church and state, both granary and courthouse. Early rulers of Lagash did not call themselves kings. Instead, they bore the title Ensi, which meant something like governor or steward. The Ensi was seen not as a monarch ruling by personal right, but as a caretaker chosen to manage the affairs of the city on behalf of its patron deity. His authority came from service, not sovereignty. The people believed that Ningirsu owned the land, and that the Insi administered it as the god's appointed representative. One of the earliest known Insis of Lagash was Yornans, who lived around 2500 BCE. Inscriptions describe him as a builder of temples and canals. He restored sanctuaries not only within Lagash, but also in surrounding towns under its influence. His reign seems to have been remembered for prosperity, and his family line produced rulers who would guide the city for several generations. Through Yornans, Lagash established a dynasty that combined religious devotion with civic management. The Insi relied on a growing class of administrators to carry out the complex work of governance. Scribes trained in cuneiform maintained accounts of land, labor, and offerings. Overseers directed teams of workers who dug canals, sowed fields, or repaired temple walls. Priests organized rituals that marked the agricultural calendar, ensuring that planting and harvesting were accompanied by the proper prayers. Soldiers guarded the fields and protected flocks from raids by neighboring city-states. In each case, the work was practical, but it was also framed as service to the god. To labor for Lagash was to labor for Ningirsu. Life for ordinary citizens reflected this blend of the sacred and the everyday. A farmer might rise at dawn, prepare his plow, and guide oxen through irrigated fields. At the end of the day, part of his harvest was set aside for the temple's storehouses. A herdsman counted his goats, knowing that a portion of wool and milk would be delivered to the god's household. A potter shaped vessels for both domestic use and ritual offerings. Even these small acts of labor tied individuals into the larger structure of the temple economy. The Insi, as the focal point of this system, lived not in a palace separate from the temple, but within its orbit. His residence was often connected to sacred precincts, and his duties included both administrative judgment and ritual participation. In festivals, he might present offerings, pour libations, or lead processions through the city streets. These public ceremonies reinforced his role not merely as a governor, but as the human extension of divine will. As Lagash grew, its rulers invested heavily in monumental building projects. Yornans and his successors built new shrines, expanded canal systems, and erected statues inscribed with their achievements. These inscriptions, pressed into clay or carved in stone, provide us with some of the earliest written records of civic pride. They describe not only the works accomplished, but also the divine approval believed to justify them. When Ur built a temple, he wrote that it was at the command of Ningirsu. When canals were dug, they were said to be blessings from the gods. In this way, the visible city became a reflection of invisible authority. Over time, the Ensi's role began to shift. What began as stewardship in the name of Ningirsu gradually took on the trappings of kingship. Military defense, once a practical necessity, became a central duty of the ruler. As neighboring city-states like Umayyur and Uruk pressed against Lagash's borders, The NC emerged as protector as well as manager. This dual-role governor of the temple economy and commander of the city's soldiers pushed Lagash further into the political landscape of Sumer. The wealth produced by its fertile fields supported these ambitions. Surplus grain could feed armies. Textiles woven by temple workers could be traded for copper or timber. Lagash's economy, rooted in religion, provided the resources needed for expansion. Yet, with expansion came tension. Boundary disputes with the neighboring city-state of Amma would one day lead to conflicts remembered in Sumerian inscriptions. These disputes were not merely about land. They were about the right to channel water, to cultivate fields, and to claim divine favor in the quiet daily lives of its citizens. However, these political rivalries were distant echoes. For most of the people of Lagash, existence remained tied to simple rhythms: the rising and setting of the sun, the planting and harvesting of crops, the festivals that marked each season. These were the measures of time. Within the cool shade of mud brick homes, families gathered around simple meals of bread, fish, and dates. Children learned to shape clay tablets, to weave reeds, or to tend animals. Life was ordinary, yet it was framed by the larger narrative of divine stewardship that gave meaning to even the smallest actions. By the close of this early period, Lagash stood as one of the most organized and prosperous Sumerian city-states. Its census had transformed a cluster of villages into a unified community. Its temple economy had created a system of wealth and order, and its people, through both labor and faith, had laid the foundation for the city's future greatness. The stage was now set for Lagash to rise to greater prominence and to face the conflicts and triumphs that would shape its history. The plains of southern Mesopotamia stretched wide and level, their horizons broken only by canals, mud brick villages, and the distant shimmer of water in the heat. In this land, where boundaries were drawn not by mountains or forests, but by lines agreed upon in fragile treaties, the city of Lagash rose to power. But its prosperity also placed it in constant tension with its neighbors. Chief among these rivals was the city of Umma, situated nearby, whose ambitions repeatedly clashed with the interests of Lagash. Between them lay a region called the Gwadena, a fertile plain whose rich soil and life-giving water made it invaluable. The Gwadena was more than land. It was survival itself. To own its fields was to possess security. To lose them was to risk hunger and decline. For this reason, Lagash and Umma returned again and again to the same dispute, making the Gwadena one of the earliest recorded flashpoints of human territorial conflict. The origins of this rivalry were not sudden. They unfolded slowly, shaped by the natural environment and the shifting courses of rivers and canals. Floods washed away boundary markers. Canals shifted direction. Memories of earlier agreements grew hazy. What one ruler declared fixed, another declared invalid, and so the question of the Gwadena never truly rested. The people of Umma came to believe that the land was theirs by right, while the citizens of Lagash were equally convinced that their god Ningersu had granted it to them. To the farmers who plowed its fields and the herders who grazed their flocks, upon its grasses, the land was simply their means of life. But to their rulers, it was a matter of pride, legitimacy, and divine favor. It was in this climate of recurring tension that Inatom Insi of Lagash came to power. He inherited a city whose wealth and order had been secured by generations of rulers before him, men like Urnans, who had strengthened temples and canals. But Enatum faced not only the responsibilities of governance, but the pressing reality of Umma's encroachment upon Lagash's lands. He did not turn away from this challenge. Instead, he raised an army, drawing upon farmers and craftsmen who exchanged their plows and tools for shields and spears. These men did not fight as scattered bands. They trained to march as one, advancing in tight formations, their shields interlocked and their weapons thrust outward. In this manner, Lagash's citizens became soldiers, their unity on the battlefield mirroring the unity of their city. The clash between Lagash and Umma was fierce, and its memory has survived across millennia through a fragmentary but extraordinary monument known as the Stele of the Vultures. This carved stone, though weathered and broken, still offers a vision of how the people of Lagash understood their struggle. On its panels, we see soldiers marching in close ranks, their spears bristling like the quills of a great beast, their shields overlapping in a wall of protection. We see the Ensi himself, Enatum, at their head, leading his people not as a distant ruler, but as a commander among them. Beneath their feet lie the bodies of their fallen enemies, strewn across the battlefield. Other scenes show carrion birds descending, feasting upon the dead. It was a grim vision, and yet a proud one, for it proclaimed the strength of Lagash and the justice of its cause. But the stele does not only show human effort. On its reverse side, the god Ningirsu himself appears, rendered as a towering figure. In his hands, he holds a great net, within which are caught the defeated soldiers of Umma. They struggle helplessly, bound by divine power, their fate sealed not by mortal arms alone, but by the will of heaven. This dual imagery tells us much about how Lagash understood war. Battles were not merely contests of strength. They were judgments rendered by the gods. Victory meant divine approval. Defeat meant divine abandonment. For Enatum and his people, to march into battle was to place themselves in the hands of Ningirsu, trusting that their god would protect them and vindicate their cause. After his victory, Enatum forced Amma to swear an oath. The defeated city pledged before the gods that it would no longer trespass into the lands of Lagash. New boundary stones were placed to mark the division. Canals were cut and measured. The agreement was sanctified with rituals and offerings. The words of the oath were inscribed, and curses were added against anyone who might dare to alter them. The treaties were clear, and for a time they were respected. Yet history tells us that peace was always temporary. In time, Amma returned to its claims. Hunger, ambition, or perhaps the restless pride of new rulers drove them once again into the Guidana, and once again Lagash was forced to defend its land. Enatum's reign is remembered largely for this great struggle, but it was not defined by war alone. He, like his predecessors, commissioned the building of temples and the restoration of canals. He reinforced the role of the Ensi as both steward of the god's household and protector of the people. His legacy, however, has been tied most strongly to the memory of the battlefield, preserved in the stone that still bears witness thousands of years later. After Enatum's time, the same conflict continued. One of his successors also faced disputes with Amma. His inscriptions tell of treaties negotiated, boundaries reaffirmed, and curses renewed. One text describes how he established boundary stones and invoked the wrath of the gods upon any who might move them. He who alters this boundary, who crosses it, may the gods strike him down. The inscription reads, "To us, these may sound like dramatic words, but to the people of Lagash they carried profound weight. The gods were not distant abstractions, but active forces in daily life, and to violate a treaty was not only to offend another city, but to risk the anger of heaven itself." In Tamina's boundary stones remind us of how fragile order was in this early world. Without mountains or seas to anchor borders, human agreements and divine oaths were the only things that kept peace. When those agreements failed, conflict returned. The people of Lagash lived always with this uncertainty. For farmers, it meant sowing fields whose ownership might tomorrow be contested. For herders, it meant grazing flocks on pastures that could be claimed by others. For scribes, it meant recording treaties they suspected would one day be broken. Yet for all this, the rhythms of daily life went on. Even in times of war, canals had to be maintained, crops had to be planted, and offerings had to be made at the temples. Soldiers might march out under the banners of Ningirsu, but at home women prepared bread, potters shaped jars, and children learned their letters in the soft clay of practice tablets. War and peace alike were framed by the unchanging needs of life. The conflict with Uma was important, but it did not halt the sun's rising or the cycles of the seasons. The memory of these wars, however, shaped the identity of Lagash. By portraying itself as the defender of divine order against oath-breakers, the city strengthened its claim to legitimacy. The stele of the vultures was not merely a record of victory, it was propaganda, declaring to friend and foe alike that Lagash was protected by Ningirsu, and that those who opposed it would fall. For the citizens of Lagash, this narrative gave meaning to their struggles. It told them that their labor, their offerings, and even their battles were part of a greater story of service to their God. Over time, though the endless disputes with Amma drained Lagash of energy and limited its ambitions, while it remained strong and respected, other cities began to rise beyond its shadow. Yorkish, and eventually the new power of Akkad, would grow to greater prominence. Lagash's legacy, though significant, would always be tied to its local struggles, its role as defender of the Gwidenna, and its devotion to Ningirsu. And yet, even as the fortunes of cities shifted, the memory of Lagash's early wars endured. They remind us that the first urban centers were not only places of cooperation and shared labor, but also of rivalry and conflict. The Gwidenna was not merely a strip of land, it was a symbol of how deeply intertwined survival, faith, and politics were in the ancient world. To fight for its fields was to fight for bread, for honor, and for the favor of the gods. Long after the battles ended, the people of Lagash continued their ordinary lives. Farmers rose at dawn to guide oxen through the soil. Shepherds watched their flocks beneath the wide, empty sky. Families gathered within the cool shade of mud-brick houses, eating bread baked from barley grown in contested fields. Children played among the reeds, unaware of treaties and curses. The Ensi presided over rituals. Scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay, and the city lived on dot to us. The wars of Lagash and Amma may appear small, mere skirmishes over narrow fields in a corner of Sumer. But to those who lived through them, they were struggles for survival, infused with meaning by the gods they worshipped and the soil they tilled. And in the long sweep of history, they stand among the first recorded wars of humankind. A reminder that from the very beginning, cities have risen not only through cooperation but through conflict. In the end, neither Lagash nor Amma was destroyed. By these disputes, both endured, rebuilt, and carried their traditions forward. The Guadena continued to feed generations of farmers. The treaties, the curses, and the monuments outlived the warriors who had fought over them. And though the names of many have faded, the stone carved in honor of Anatum still speaks. It whispers of shields and spears, of boundaries and oaths, of gods and men, and of a city determined to protect its land. The city of Lagash, though often remembered for its battles with Umma, was more than a place of conflict. It was also a community where people worked, worshipped, and lived out the routines of daily existence. Generations passed after the victories of Inatum and the treaties of Intimina. The canals still carried water across the plain. The temples still stood as the heart of civic life. But time and prosperity also brought changes, some welcome, some troubling, and some that would lead to reforms under one of the most unusual rulers in early Mesopotamian history. As the years went on, the temple households of Lagash grew larger and more powerful. At first, this brought stability. The temples organized labor, collected harvests, distributed rations, and oversaw building projects. But over time, the balance between religious stewardship and political control became blurred. Officials within the temple system began to accumulate wealth and privilege. Priests demanded larger offerings. Administrators took more than their share from the storehouses. The burden of these excesses fell upon the ordinary citizens, farmers, herders, craftsmen who provided the goods and labor that supported the temple economy. The inscriptions that survive from this period tell of growing discontent. They describe abuses of power in which temple officials seized fields, taxed people heavily, and claimed property that had once belonged to families. Even the burial of the dead was said to be controlled by temple elites who charged high fees and forced mourners into costly rituals. To live in Lagash during this time was still to live under the shadow of the gods. But the human intermediaries who managed divine property often acted with self-interest. It was against this background that Urukagina rose to power. He was not a conqueror in the mold of Inatum. His name is not attached to great victories over neighboring cities, nor to monumental steles showing armies in formation. Instead, his legacy lies in what we might call reform. He attempted to correct the excesses of the temple system and to restore fairness for ordinary people. His inscriptions, some of the earliest surviving legal texts in human history, describe a sweeping program of changes meant to protect the poor, restrain the powerful, and bring Lagash back into balance. Urukagina declared that the widow and the orphan should no longer be at the mercy of officials who might exploit them. He limited the demands that priests could place upon families, especially during burials and marriages, when people were most vulnerable. He forbade the seizure of property without due cause. He reorganized the distribution of temple offerings so that they would no longer enrich a small circle of elites, but would instead serve the community more broadly. In essence, Urukagina attempted to reduce corruption and restore justice. For the citizens of Lagash, these reforms must have been deeply felt. Imagine a farmer who had long been required to give up a large portion of his harvest, not only to the temple, but also to corrupt officials who demanded more than was due. Under Urukagina, he might find some relief, his obligations reduced to a more sustainable level. A widow, fearful of losing her husband's land to unscrupulous priests, might now have the protection of written decrees that preserved her rights. A family preparing to bury their dead could do so without crippling expense. These changes touched daily life in immediate and practical ways. Urukagina also sought to reduce the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of the temple institutions. He restored fields that had been seized back to their original owners. He protected smallholders from the encroachment of larger estates. These measures reflected not only a sense of justice, but also an understanding that the health of the city depended on the well-being of its ordinary citizens. A community strained by unfair burdens could not endure. By lightening those burdens, Urukagina aimed to strengthen Lagash as a whole. It is tempting to view Urukagina as a champion of the common people, and in some sense he was. But his reforms were also pragmatic. A city plagued by corruption risks instability. Discontented citizens might refuse to work, resist authority, or even revolt. By curbing abuses, Urukagina reinforced his own legitimacy as Ensi. He presented himself as the servant of Ninjutsu, who ensured that divine justice was done on earth. His authority was strengthened by his fairness, and fairness was reinforced by the authority of the gods. Life under Urukagina then offers us a rare glimpse into the earliest stirrings of what we might call social justice, long before codes of law like that of Hammurabi, long before the polished philosophies of later civilizations. The citizens of Lagash saw their ruler inscribe reforms designed to protect them from exploitation. To live in Lagash at this time was to experience, however briefly, a vision of governance that sought balance rather than domination. The daily rhythms of the city continued, much as they had before. Farmers still walked to their fields at dawn, oxen pulling wooden plows through the soil softened by irrigation. Children still carried baskets of reeds, still helped their mothers grind barley into flour, still learned the basics of cuneiform under the watchful eye of scribes. Potters turned clay upon their wheels. Weavers stretched wool upon looms. Merchants carried goods to and from the market. Temples continued to host festivals with music, chanting, and offerings filling the air. Life was ordinary, and yet behind it all lay the quieter influence of reform, shaping what burdens families carried and how their labor was valued. One can imagine the relief of a craftsman who no longer feared sudden confiscation of his workshop by an official. One can picture the quiet gratitude of a family allowed to bury their loved ones without falling into debt. These were not grand victories won on battlefields, but they mattered no less to the people who lived them. Still, reform could not erase the realities of Mesopotamian politics. Lagash remained a city among many, vulnerable to rivalry and invasion. Urukagina's attempts to build justice within his walls did not shield him from threats beyond them. In the end, Lagash's fate would be determined not only by fairness at home but by power abroad. Neighboring city-states continued to contend for dominance, and eventually Lagash itself would fall under the shadow of stronger powers. But in the quiet spaces of its history, in the simple clay tablets that preserve his decrees, Urukagina left a legacy that endures. His reforms show us that even in the earliest days of cities, people recognized the dangers of corruption, the importance of fairness, and the responsibility of rulers to protect the vulnerable. He may not have built great monuments or conquered vast territories, but his concern for justice has echoed across the centuries, a small but remarkable moment in the long story of human civilization. For the people of Lagash, life moved steadily forward. The canals still carried water through the fields. The temple of Ningirsu still rose at the city's heart, its mud brick walls standing firm against the passing years. Festivals were still celebrated, with musicians playing lyres and drums, while dancers moved in rhythm before the altars. Children still played in the narrow streets, their laughter rising above the hum of daily work. And all the while, the people lived under the reforms of Urukagina, reforms that sought to make their lives just a little more fair, a little more bearable. In a world where so much was uncertain, when we think of Lagash now, we remember its wars with Uma, its monuments, its inscriptions. But we should also remember the quieter story of a ruler who tried to lessen the weight of injustice, who wrote down protections for those who had little voice, who sought to shape his city into something more humane. In that effort, brief though it may have been, we see not only the history of Lagash, but the beginnings of a larger human dream, the dream of a society where power serves the people and not the other way around. The city of Lagash, like all cities of Sumer, did not remain forever at the height of its strength. The same plains that nourished its fields also left it exposed to the ambitions of rivals, and the same canals that gave life to its people also served as highways for invading armies. The reforms of Urukagina had brought a measure of fairness within the walls, but beyond those walls, forces gathered that no decree could hold back. The city of Amma, so long a rival, found new strength under the leadership of a man named Lugalzagasi, and it was he who would bring an end to Lagash's independence. Lugalzagasi was ambitious, far beyond the usual horizon of Sumerian rulers, where most kings were content to rule their own city and its surrounding lands. He dreamed of uniting the southern plains under one authority. To achieve this, he began by subduing his neighbors, and among them Lagash was a natural target. Old quarrel over the fertile lands of the Guidena was never forgotten, and the victories of Inatone and Intamina still echoed as memories of humiliation for Uma to defeat. Lagash was not only to gain territory, but to avenge generations of rivalry. The conflict that followed is remembered not through triumphal monuments of Lagash, but through inscriptions of its conqueror. Lugalzagasi boasted that he had destroyed the city, that he had carried fire and ruin into its temples, that he had broken its walls and humbled its people. The proud center of Ningirsu's worship was desecrated, its wealth plundered, its authority shattered. Where once the stele of the vultures had proclaimed victory and divine favor, now Lagash tasted defeat and the bitter silence of fallen stones. For the citizens of Lagash, the conquest was not a matter of lofty inscriptions, but of lived experience. They saw the smoke rising above their streets. They heard the cries of families separated and the clash of weapons in narrow lanes. Temples that had once been places of refuge became scenes of violation. Storehouses were emptied. Statues of gods were carried away as trophies. For those who had trusted in the eternal protection of Ningirsu, it must have been a time of confusion, sorrow, and despair. Did their god abandon them? Had the oaths sworn on boundary stones meant nothing? Or had the balance of divine favor shifted to Uma and its ambitious king? These were questions whispered in the quiet after conquest, questions without easy answers. And yet, even in the face of defeat, daily life did not entirely vanish. The canals still flowed, though they were neglected. The barley still sprouted in the fields, though the harvest was taken by new masters. Families still gathered within their mud-brick homes, though their conversations were hushed and uncertain. Life continued, but it was life under domination, life lived at the will of another city's ruler. To be a citizen of Lagash in this time was to live with memory, to recall a time of strength and justice, now replaced by submission. His ambitions carried him across Sumer, city by city, until he proclaimed himself king of the land. For a brief moment, he appeared to have succeeded where others had failed, bringing unity to the fractious world of the southern plain. But his reign was short-lived, for beyond Sumer, new powers were rising. From the north came Sargon of Akkad, a man of humble origins who would carve out the world's first empire. Sargon defeated Lugalzagasi, bound him, and displayed him publicly as a conquered king. With this victory, Lagash and all of Sumer entered a new era. No longer the stage of local rivalries, but part of a larger imperial order. For the people of Lagash, this shift must have been both strange and unsettling. They had known conflict with their neighbors, disputes over fields and canals. But now their city was absorbed into something larger, ruled from a capital far away. Orders came not from the Insi of Lagash, but from the court of Akkad. Soldiers patrolled whose language carried northern accents. Taxes and tributes flowed not only to local temples, but to distant rulers. The rhythms of daily life continued, yet they did so beneath a wider shadow. Still, even in decline, the memory of Lagash endured. Families passed down stories of Anadam's victories, of Antemena's treaties, of Urukagina's reforms. Scribes copied old inscriptions. The stele of the vultures, broken but not forgotten, lay as a reminder of past glory. The city that had once defended the Guadena and proclaimed justice in the name of Ningirsu was not erased entirely. It lived on in fragments, in ruins, in the stubborn persistence of its people. Defeat did not erase the needs of daily existence. Farmers still guided their plows. Women still ground barley into flour. Children still played along the canals, their laughter mingling with the calls of water birds. Potters still shaped clay into jars, and weavers still drew thread across wooden looms. Life in Lagash became quieter, more subdued, but it remained life. In the long story of Mesopotamia, cities rose and fell, rulers came and went, but ordinary people endured, adapting to each new order with resilience. The fall of Lagash to Lugalzagasi and the rise of Akkad remind us that even the most powerful cities of early Sumer were fragile. Their walls could be broken, their gods' temples looted, their treaties ignored. Yet the memory of what they achieved lingered. Lagash had been a place where early kings marched in tight formations, where treaties were inscribed in clay, where gods were invoked to guard the boundaries of fields, where a ruler once sought to protect the widow and the orphan. These things remained, carried forward in record and tradition, shaping how later generations understood justice, authority, and the responsibilities of kingship. As night falls upon our imagination of the city, we might picture Lagash not in the moment of its defeat, but in the quieter scenes that continued afterward. A farmer kneeling to inspect his crop, a scribe carefully pressing signs into a clay tablet, a family gathered within a courtyard, sharing a simple meal of bread and dates. The city was humbled, yes, but it lived on. For cities are more than their rulers, more than their victories and defeats. They are the accumulation of countless lives, lived steadily through changing times. Lagash, though conquered, remained a thread in the great tapestry of Mesopotamian history. Its stones may have been broken, its power diminished, but its memory endures, whispering across millennia of the first struggles for land, of the first reforms of justice, and of the fragile yet enduring resilience of human community. The story of Lagash did not end with its defeat at the hands of Lugal-Zagassi and the conquest that followed from Sargon of Akkad. Like many Mesopotamian cities, it endured, adapting itself to new circumstances, reshaping its life under the shadow of empire. Cities in this land were resilient. Walls could crumble and rulers could fall, but the canals still ran, the fields still produced barley, and the people still gathered within their mud-brick courtyards. What changed was not the heartbeat of daily existence, but the larger authority under which that life was organized. Lagash, once an independent city-state, became a loyal, if subdued, part of the Akkadian realm. The empire of Akkad stretched further than most people of Lagash could ever travel. It drew in cities to the north, reaching toward the lands of the upper Tigris, and pressed westward to the fringes of Syria, to the people who lived their whole lives among the southern canals. This world was vast, almost unimaginable, and yet they found themselves within it. Orders now came not from their own NC alone, but from governors who carried the seal of Akkadian rulers. Clay tablets, inscribed in both Sumerian and the Akkadian tongue, recorded the flow of tribute, labor, and goods. Each wedge pressed into wet clay was a reminder that Lagash was no longer the center of its own destiny, but part of something larger. The shift was felt first in the collection of tribute. Grain, wool, fish, and oil were measured out with precision, sealed under the eyes of scribes, and dispatched toward the imperial capital. The farmers of Lagash tilled their soil, as they always had, bending over furrows in the cool hours of morning, guiding water through small irrigation ditches, and driving plows pulled by oxen. But now, when harvest came, the best of the yield was taken away. Carts creaked along the roads, bearing sacks of barley and jars of oil toward distant storehouses. For the farmer, this meant longer hours and leaner shares, though the fields themselves did not change. The barley still sprouted in neat rows, the reeds still rustled in the canals, but the fruits of this labor now served a wider realm. Yet empire also brought connection. Traders from distant lands appeared more frequently in the markets of Lagash. Copper from the east, cedar wood from the mountains, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan passed through the city, handled by merchants who counted their goods beneath the watchful eyes of Akkadian officials. These materials, once rare, became part of daily life for craftsmen. A sculptor might now shape harder stone into small figurines. A jeweler might string blue stones into necklaces. A scribe might carve his seal with sharper detail on a cylinder of imported stone. Such goods reminded the people that while they had lost independence, they had gained access to a wider world. Language, too, shifted under the influence of empire. Sumerian remained the sacred tongue of rituals and temple inscriptions, but Akkadian grew more common in administration and trade. Children learning to write were trained in both, their styluses moving carefully across clay tablets as they copied lists of words in 2 languages. For the older generation, the presence of Akkadian words in daily speech may have sounded strange, even unwelcome, but to the young it was natural, simply the way of things. The bilingual hum of scribes at work became a soundtrack of this new era, a quiet blend of tradition and change. Religion adjusted but did not disappear. Ningersu still presided over Lagash, and his temple remained the great heart of the city. Pilgrims still approached with offerings, priests still conducted chants, and the statue of the god was still tended with care. Yet imperial gods were honored, too, their names added to prayers, their shrines set alongside older sanctuaries. It was not unusual for Mesopotamians to acknowledge many divine powers, and so this integration felt less like replacement and more like addition. Still, the subtle rebalancing of ritual reflected the political reality. Lagash was under Akkadian rule, and the gods of empire had to be acknowledged. For the ordinary people, daily life remained marked by familiar rhythms. At dawn, smoke rose from hearths as women baked flat loaves of bread from ground barley. Children fetched water in clay jars from canals and wells. Men led animals to pasture or guided boats heavy with reeds and fish. In workshops, potters shaped clay, their wheels, turning steadily, while weavers stretched wool across looms, their hands moving in quiet rhythm. The empire did not erase these patterns. It added layers of obligation and authority above them, but the core of daily life endured. In this way, Lagash continued, a city of workers, farmers, scribes, and priests, all living under the watchful eye of both their local gods and distant rulers. The scribes of Lagash felt the empire most keenly. Records multiplied as every transaction, every delivery, every measure of tribute had to be documented. The scratching of styluses against clay echoed in storerooms filled with tablets. Cylinder seals of Akkadian style impressed scenes of kings, soldiers, and gods onto the wet surfaces, declaring authority in images as well as words. To be a scribe was to stand at the crossroads of tradition and empire, copying the old hymns to Ningersu in one tablet while inscribing quotas of barley. For Akkadian officials, on another, their work preserved the memory of Lagash's past, even as it secured the demands of its present. The city's streets still carried the same smells of baking bread, roasting fish, and damp reeds drying in the sun. The same narrow lanes wound. Between houses of mud brick, their walls patched after each rainy season, their roofs covered with mats to block the heat. Children still chased each other through the alleys, their laughter unchanged by politics. Yet in these same streets, imperial soldiers sometimes marched, their presence a reminder that Lagash was not free. Their helmets gleamed in the sun, their weapons carefully maintained, their accents marking them as men from the north. For the people watching them pass, there may have been unease, but also a recognition that these soldiers enforced stability, keeping order among cities that had once fought one another endlessly. Conversations within households revealed the mix of resignation and adaptation. An old man might grumble about the tribute owed to Akkad, remembering days when Lagash had been master of its own fields. A young scribe might speak eagerly of new opportunities, hoping to serve in the imperial court. A mother might measure out flour carefully, worrying whether the ration would last until the next delivery. A priest might remind his listeners that the God's will was mysterious, and that even the rise of distant rulers must be accepted as part of divine order. These were not loud debates, but quiet exchanges, woven into the fabric of daily life, reflecting the balance between memory of the past and acceptance of the present. Over time, the children of Lagash grew up knowing only empire. For them, independence was a story, not a reality. They heard tales of Anadam's victories, of the boundary stones in the Guidena, of Urakajina's reforms. They listened as elders recited the names of past rulers, but they themselves bowed to Akkadian authority without question. For them, empire was not loss, but simply the world as it existed. The cycle of memory shifted with each generation, as living recollection faded into story, and story became legend. Even so, the city's past remained visible in its ruins and inscriptions. Broken steles still stood in the fields. Clay tablets preserved in temples still carried words of earlier rulers. The names of Ningirsu, Urakajina, and Anadam were still carved in stone, whispering of a time when Lagash had stood tall. The people did not forget entirely, even as they lived in a new reality. To walk through the city was to walk in layers of time, where the present of empire rested upon the foundations of the past. Night in Lagash remained much as it had always been. The sun dipped below the flat horizon, and the sky filled with stars. Families gathered in courtyards, eating simple meals of bread, fish, and dates. The sounds of animals settled into stillness. The air cooled, and the canals reflected the dim light of the moon. For those lying awake, the thought of empire may have lingered faintly, but more immediate were the concerns of the next day's labor, the tending of fields, the weaving of cloth, the baking of bread. Politics and power might shift, but life continued in steady rhythm, bound to the cycles of water, soil, and sky. Thus, Lagash endured under the Akkadian Empire, no longer sovereign, yet still alive, its people adapting quietly to new demands, while carrying forward the habits of generations. The city remained both humbled and resilient, its independence gone, but its identity not erased. It stood as a place of continuity amid change, one thread in the vast tapestry of Mesopotamian history, whispering across the centuries of the endurance of human community beneath the ebb and flow of empire. Life in Lagash under the Akkadian Empire unfolded not through sudden upheavals, but through the slow and steady rhythm of ordinary days. The city was no longer free to decide its fate, but for most of its inhabitants, what mattered most was not the distant rule of Sargon or his successors, but the familiar tasks that filled the hours from dawn until dusk. The empire formed the backdrop, but the stage of life was set in kitchens, in fields, along canals, and within the narrow lanes of the city itself. To fall asleep with Lagash is to enter this world of steady repetition, where the details of living became the substance of history. The day began early, long before the heat of the Mesopotamian sun rose over the plain. Farmers stirred from their reed mats while the sky was still dim. In the courtyards of simple houses, women ground barley into flour on stone querns, pushing heavy stones back and forth with practiced strength. The scraping sound echoed quietly in the stillness of morning. Small fires were lit in clay hearths, smoke curling into the cool air as bread was baked on flat clay pans. Children carried jars to the canals, balancing them carefully on their hips as they filled them with water, then staggered back to their homes. Life in Lagash always began with preparation for labor, the nourishment and supplies needed to sustain the day's work. For the farmer, the central task was the field. Barley remained the staple crop as it had for centuries. Irrigation defined its success. Farmers walked along narrow embankments between canals, opening and closing small channels with their feet or with clumps of clay to let water pass where it was needed. The soil of the alluvial plain was rich, but required constant attention. Too little water, and the fields dried. Too much, and they flooded. Each decision shaped the harvest months later. Farmers bent low to pull weeds, guided oxen yoked to wooden plows, and scattered seed by hand, casting it wide with practiced gestures. These movements were repeated day after day, year after year, forming a rhythm as steady as breathing dot beyond the fields. Shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats. Their animals grazed in pasturelands or on the stubble left behind after harvest. Sheep provided wool, one of the great resources of Lagash, spun into thread and woven into cloth that was traded both locally and across the empire. Goats gave milk, and sometimes their skins were used for water containers. The bleating of flocks carried across the plain, a sound as familiar as the rush of water in the canals. Shepherds lived much of their lives outdoors, guiding their animals beneath the wide Mesopotamian sky, sleeping near them to guard against thieves or predators, moving with them from one patch of grazing to another. Within the city itself, artisans filled workshops with the sounds of craft. Potters shaped clay, spinning their wheels with steady pressure, their hands smoothing the wet surface of jars, bowls, and storage vessels. The smell of damp clay mixed with the smoky heat of kilns as vessels were fired. Each household required jars for grain, for oil, for water, and so the potter's work was endless. Weavers, often women, worked with looms stretched across courtyards. Woolen threads were pulled, taut, and shuttles passed back and forth in a slow rhythm, producing cloth both plain and decorated. Dyers added color, using natural pigments, staining wool in shades of red, brown, and occasionally blue. Leatherworkers prepared hides, carpenters shaped wood, and metalworkers hammered copper into tools. Each craft sustained the daily needs of the city, and together they filled its lanes with the quiet hum of industry. The houses of Lagash were simple but enduring. Constructed from sun-dried mud bricks, they stood close together along narrow, winding streets. Their walls were plain, smoothed with clay plaster, and often whitewashed to reflect the sun. Roofs were flat, made of timber beams, covered with mats, and more layers of clay. Families used their rooftops for sleeping during the hot summer nights, spreading mats and blankets beneath the stars. Inside, rooms were small and arranged around a central courtyard that admitted light and air. The courtyard was the heart of the house, where meals were prepared, weaving was done, and children played under the eyes of their mothers. Life flowed in and out of these spaces, as constant as the sun rising and setting. Food formed the basis of both labor and rest. Barley bread was eaten with nearly every meal, often accompanied by dates from the palm groves that grew along canals and ditches. Fish from the waterways were common, roasted over small fires or dried in the sun for storage. On special days, mutton or goat might be cooked in stews. Milk was consumed in various forms, sometimes soured into yogurt-like drinks. Beer, brewed from barley, was the staple beverage, thick and nutritious, drunk from clay cups or through straws from large jars. The diet was simple, repetitive, and sustaining, providing the energy required for unending cycles of work. Clothing was equally straightforward. Wool was the most common material, woven into garments that draped over the body. Men often wore simple skirts tied at the waist, leaving the upper body bare, while women wore longer dresses, sometimes with shawls draped over their shoulders. The garments were plain for most, though wealthier citizens could afford dyed cloth or decorative fringes. Sandals of leather protected the feet, though many walked barefoot on the warm earth of streets and courtyards. Hairstyles varied. Men often shaved their heads or wore simple caps, while women braided their hair, sometimes tying it with strips of cloth. Jewelry, when available, was treasured beads of shell, carnelian, or lapis strung together into necklaces or bracelets. These small adornments added beauty to lives otherwise marked by necessity. Festivals offered moments of joy and community. Despite the weight of empire, the religious calendar of Lagash continued to mark the year with celebrations for Ningirsu and other deities. Processions wound through the streets, with statues of gods carried on platforms, accompanied by music. From drums and pipes, offerings were brought to temples, bread, beer, animals for sacrifice. People gathered to sing hymns, to clap hands, to watch ritual dramas performed by priests. For a time, daily labor gave way to communal joy. Children followed the processions wide-eyed, while adults offered prayers for health, fertility, and prosperity. These festivals reaffirmed the bond between the people and their gods, a bond that persisted even under foreign rule. The temple remained the spiritual and social heart of the city. Priests conducted rituals, maintained sacred fires, and recited hymns that had been passed down for generations. Scribes in temple workshops copied texts, preserving old hymns while recording new offerings. The temple was also an economic institution, owning fields, employing laborers, and distributing food. In many ways, the temple was as much a center of administration as of worship. People brought their concerns to its gates, and its presence reminded all that the divine order stood above human politics. The empire could change rulers, but Ningirsu remained. Children grew up within this world of routine. They learned to fetch water, to tend animals, to shape clay into small toys, to watch their parents at work. Boys of wealthier families might be sent to scribal schools, where they learned to form wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets, practicing lists of signs until their hands grew steady. Girls learned domestic tasks, weaving, grinding grain, preparing food. Their games echoed through the courtyards, tossing clay balls, racing in the alleys, playing with little figurines carved from wood or clay. These childhoods were shaped less by empire than by the steady cycles of home, family, and neighborhood. The marketplace was another hub of daily activity. Merchants set out their goods in open spaces near temples or along broad streets. Buyers examined jars of oil, baskets of dates, bolts of cloth, and small trinkets of stone or metal. Transactions were often sealed with clay tokens or marked on tablets by scribes who kept accounts. The marketplace was also a place of news and rumor, where travelers from other cities might share stories of distant events. Here, the empire felt a little closer, as traders spoke of Akkad, of the campaigns of kings, of distant conquests. Yet for most, such news was background, while the true concern was whether the price of barley was fair, or whether the jar of beer would last through the evening. Evenings in Lagash were quiet. After the day's work, families gathered in their courtyards to eat, to talk, to rest. The heat of the day gave way to cooler air, and people sat on mats, watching the light fade from the sky. The streets grew still, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the cry of a child. Stars spread across the wide plain above, unbroken by mountains or tall structures. The same constellations that had guided generations of farmers and priests still looked down upon the city. The empire might stretch far, but the sky was the same, eternal and unchanging. This was the life of Lagash under the Akkadians, steady, repetitive, rooted in necessity, yet marked by moments of beauty and faith. The people worked, ate, worshipped, and slept, their lives unfolding within courtyards of mud, brick, and beneath the stars of Mesopotamia. Though their rulers had changed, the rhythm of their days did not. They endured, as they always had, in the quiet persistence of ordinary existence. And so the city continued. Its people rose each morning, worked through the heat of the day, gathered in the cool of evening, and laid down beneath the night sky. Their history was not written in battles or decrees, but in the countless small acts that filled their hours, the grinding of grain. In Lagash, under the Akkadian Empire, one of the most important figures in the quiet machinery of daily life was the scribe. The city had always valued writing, but in this period, the role of the scribe became even more central, for empire depended on records, grain collected as tax, sheep counted for temple offerings, workers assigned to fields, jars of oil dispatched to distant storehouses. Every movement of goods and people was pressed into clay with the tip of a reed stylus. The scribe was not a warrior, nor a farmer, nor a priest in the fullest sense, but without him the empire could not function. His marks gave order to things, and his memory preserved what would otherwise be lost in the rush of time. The school of the scribe was a demanding place. Boys of certain families, often connected to temple or administration, sat cross-legged on the floor, clay tablets before them. They held styluses of reed and copied lists of signs again and again. The wedge-shaped impressions had to be precise, angled correctly, spaced evenly. A master scribe watched over them, correcting mistakes, making them repeat until the hand grew steady. They began with simple lists names of animals, names of plants, numbers. Then they copied proverbs, hymns, royal decrees. Slowly, through repetition, they entered the world of written language. For many, this training lasted years, filled with long days of pressing clay until fingers grew sore and shoulders stiff. The script they learned was complex, a system of signs that could represent words, syllables, and ideas. Sumerian remained the sacred language of ritual and tradition, while Akkadian was increasingly used in administration and communication across the empire. The scribes of Lagash often had to know both, writing bilingual lists and documents that bridged the old world and the new. To those outside the craft, the tablets may have seemed mysterious, covered in wedges and strokes, but to the scribe they were alive with meaning, contracts, inventories, hymns, decrees. In their hands, clay became memory, preserving the city's daily life. Law, too, depended on writing, though the most famous law codes of Mesopotamia would come later. In Lagash, there were already traditions of legal reform and record. A ruler before the empire had been remembered for issuing decrees to protect the poor from the abuse of officials, and echoes of that reform lingered in memory. Under Akkadian authority, legal matters were documented with greater rigor. Contracts for the sale of land, for marriage, for adoption, for labor agreements all were inscribed on tablets, sealed with cylinder seals, rolled across the clay. The seal bore the image of its owner, a small scene of gods or animals that served as a signature. These contracts were stored in archives, each tablet placed carefully in baskets or jars, waiting to be consulted when disputes arose. The people of Lagash may not have spoken of law in abstract terms, but they lived with its weight. A man might go to a scribe to record the transfer of a field from one family to another. A woman might bring a witness to seal an agreement about her dowry. Merchants documented loans, noting the amount of silver or grain to be repaid. Workers signed agreements for service, promising to labor for a certain number of months in exchange for rations. In all these acts, clay tablets became silent witnesses, ensuring that memory was fixed, that words spoken were not forgotten. Law was not just a decree from above, but the daily act of recording promises and obligations. The archives of Lagash grew heavy with these records. In temple storerooms, shelves held rows of tablets, their edges inscribed with identifying marks, so that they could be retrieved. The smell of dried clay filled these rooms, and the air carried the faint dust of centuries. To step into such a space was to step into the memory of the city. Each tablet was small, but together they formed a web of connections. Who owed what? Who had promised what? Who had received what? For the ordinary people, these tablets were distant. Their skill gave them status, but they were also servants of temple and state. They sat for hours each day with tablets balanced on their knees, styluses in hand, copying lists, recording deliveries, issuing receipts. Their voices were low, murmuring as they read back the words they inscribed. They worked in the heat, their hands streaked with clay, their eyes narrowed in concentration. It was patient, repetitive work, and yet it carried immense weight, for it was through their labor that empire was sustained. Education for scribes extended beyond writing. They studied mathematics, learning to calculate rations, to measure fields, to divide shares. They learned to read signs of the heavens, for astronomy, was tied to ritual and calendar. They memorized hymns and proverbs, absorbing not only technical skill but cultural tradition. A good scribe was not merely a recorder, but a man of knowledge, one who could advise officials, interpret omens, compose prayers. In this way, the scribes of Lagash connected the practical and the sacred, the economic and the divine. Temples, too, relied on their skill. Offerings to the gods were carefully recorded. How many sheep, how much oil, how much grain. Hymns were written down, preserving words once passed only by memory. The calendar of rituals, the list of priests, the inventory of sacred objects were kept on clay. Without such records, the temple could not manage its vast holdings or its complex rituals. The scribes stood in the background, unseen by the worshippers who brought their offerings, but their work sustained the rhythm of worship itself. Even the smallest details of daily life passed through their hands. A worker receiving his ration of barley had it marked on a tablet. A weaver assigned wool for her loom had her name listed in neat wedges. Each of these notes was part of a larger pattern tying individual lives into the system of city and empire. The people of Lagash might not have thought of themselves as participants in a great structure, but through the work of scribes, their actions were woven into that structure. Nonetheless, the language of empire shaped the very way people thought of their world. Akkadian words crept into Sumerian speech, especially in matters of administration. Tablets might be written in one language, annotated in another. Children in scribal schools recited word lists that matched Sumerian to Akkadian, training their tongues to move between worlds. Lagash was still Sumerian in heart, but its scribes wrote in the language of empire as well. Memory itself was preserved in these tablets. Without writing, the deeds of kings and priests faded with the passing of generations. With writing, they endured. In Lagash, this tradition had long been present, but under the Akkadians it grew wider, linking the city to the larger memory of empire. The scribes of Lagash became not only servants of their city, but contributors to a shared human record. The work of law and record-keeping shaped the sense of order in society. People might complain of tribute, of labor demands, of officials, burdens, but they also knew that agreements were written, that promises could be checked, that disputes could be resolved by consulting the tablets. In this sense, writing brought a kind of stability, a framework within which life could unfold. It was imperfect, subject to corruption and error, but it gave structure to what might otherwise have been chaos. The clay tablets were small anchors of certainty in a world that often felt uncertain at night. When the scribes put aside their styluses and left their tablets to dry in the warm air, they walked home through the narrow streets just like everyone else. They ate their barley bread, drank their beer, told their children stories of gods and heroes. Their work may have been specialized, but their lives were woven into the same rhythms of food, family, and faith. Yet in their clay tablets they left a legacy greater than most realized, for it was through their careful records that the story of Lagash and of Mesopotamia itself survived into memory. And so the city lived, its laws inscribed, its contracts sealed, its knowledge passed from hand to hand, from teacher to student, from one generation of scribes to the next. Each mark in clay was small, but together they formed a continuity that outlasted empires. Lagash, humbled by conquest, preserved its identity through these quiet acts of record. Long after kings and conquerors were forgotten, the tablets of scribes remained, carrying forward the memory of a city that endured in words as much as in stone. The people of Lagash may have thought little of it as they slept on their rooftops beneath the stars. But in the steady scratching of styluses and the drying of clay lay the foundation of civilization itself, the habit of writing, the preservation of thought, the codification of law, the quiet shaping of order from the raw material of daily life. In the silence of night, the city dreamed not of battles, but of records, and in those dreams it found its place in history. The economy of Lagash during the Akkadian Age unfolded in quiet and steady cycles, much like the flow of its canals. Trade and exchange were not occasional acts, but daily rhythms woven into the very fabric of city life. From the smallest farmer, carrying surplus barley to the temple storehouse, to the merchant guiding caravans across the flat horizon, each person played a role in the intricate web that sustained the city. To walk through Lagash was to sense this unbroken current of goods and labor, moving constantly, silently tying individuals to families, families to neighborhoods, neighborhoods to temples, and temples to empire. It began with the fields, the farmers. Harvest was not his alone. Barley, wheat, dates, onions, and garlic, gathered after months of labor, were divided carefully. A share went to the family to eat and store. Another portion was carried along dusty tracks to the temple storehouses, where scribes weighed and measured it, pressing the transaction into clay tablets. The state required its own share as well, collected as tax or tribute. This system ensured that no harvest remained entirely private. The produce of one man's land became part of the collective wealth of the city, and from there, part of the empire's lifeblood. Storehouses filled slowly, their rooms packed with jars of grain sealed with clay stoppers, each marked with the sign of the official who oversaw the delivery. Tall baskets held dates dried in the sun until their sweetness grew dense and lasting. Rows of clay vessels stored sesame oil, its surface glistening faintly in the dim light. These storehouses were not just buildings, but nodes in a network of supply. From them, rations were distributed to workers, offerings were given to temples, and merchants drew stock for trade. The abundance of Lagash was carefully guarded, recorded, and rationed, never left to chance. The ration system touched nearly everyone. A worker employed on a canal received daily measures of barley, sometimes a jar of beer, perhaps a little oil. A craftsman weaving wool for the temple might be allotted grain for his household, the payment written onto a tablet and sealed. Even the lowest laborer understood the weight of these rations, for they were the means by which families survived. To miss a ration day meant hunger. To have one's share reduced was a quiet disaster. And so the rhythm of distribution tied each person to the broader structure of the city's economy, a bond reinforced by scribes and seals as much as by custom. Merchants formed another vital link in the system. They traveled by land and water, carrying goods from Lagash outward and returning with treasures from distant regions. The rivers and canals were highways, their currents carrying boats laden with jars, baskets, and bundles. Flat-bottomed vessels, moved slowly through the waterways, pushed by poles or guided by sails when the wind was favorable. The boats creaked under the weight of cargo, grain destined for other towns, woolen cloth woven in Lagash's courtyards, reeds cut from its marshes, fish dried under its sun. The movement was steady, never hurried, for river travel required patience. On land, caravans stretched across the horizon. Donkeys bore panniers filled with goods, their hooves kicking up dust as they walked. Merchants traveled with guards and helpers, their progress measured not in speed but in survival. Paths led eastward toward the Zagros Mountains, where timber and metals could be obtained. Others extended southward, linking to routes that eventually touched the Gulf, bringing shells, pearls, and exotic stones. To the west lay the open trade, toward other Sumerian cities, and, beyond them, toward the lands that connected with the Mediterranean. Each route demanded endurance, but each returned to Lagash with goods that could not be found in its own plain. The goods of Lagash were both ordinary and extraordinary. Barley remained the staple export, for its abundance made it the coin of the land. Cloth woven from sheep's wool was also a major commodity, valued for its utility across Mesopotamia. Reeds from the marshes, though common locally, found their way elsewhere, useful for mats, baskets, and even construction. Fish, salted or dried, traveled in jars. In exchange, Lagash received what it could not produce. Copper from the mountains came in heavy ingots, ready to be hammered into tools and weapons. Hardwoods arrived in beams, stronger than the local palm trunks. Stones, both precious and ordinary, were carried back, for in the alluvial plain stone was scarce. A single block of limestone could become a treasured altar, while lapis from distant lands became beads for necklaces. The marketplace within the city reflected this constant flow. Stalls lined the open spaces, shaded with mats and cloths, where merchants displayed their wares. One might see baskets of dates piled high, the sticky fruit shining in the sun. Another stall offered woolen cloth folded neatly, its colors dull, or dyed with faint earth tones. Small jars of oil stood in rows, their surfaces sealed with clay caps. Buyers walked among them, inspecting goods, bargaining quietly. Payments were sometimes made in silver, weighed on balances, though more often they were measured in grain. Contracts could be verbal, but more often scribes were called to inscribe the agreement. Even the purchase of a few jars might leave behind a tablet, sealed with a cylinder depicting a lion or a god. Trade tied Lagash not only to its neighbors, but to the vast system of the Akkadian Empire. The reach of Akkad meant that goods could circulate more freely across long distances, protected by imperial armies and administered by imperial officials. Merchants from Lagash could move with a degree of safety, their travels recognized under the authority of Sargon and his successors. In return, Lagash itself was required to contribute to the needs of empire. Soldiers, grain, cloth. The empire gave and took, and the economy of Lagash was bound ever tighter to it. The presence of foreign goods within the city left subtle marks on daily life. A household might possess a vessel made from imported stone, cool and smooth to the touch. A wealthy woman might wear a bead of lapis lazuli, its deep blue unlike anything from the plain. A craftsman might work with metal that had traveled hundreds of miles, These items were rare, but their presence reminded people that Lagash was part of a larger world, connected to lands far beyond the horizon. Even if a farmer never left his fields, his life was touched by distant places. For the ordinary person, the economy was not experienced as grand trade routes or imperial demands, but as the weight of daily necessities. A man carried his surplus grain to the storehouse and hoped the scribes recorded it fairly. A woman went to the market to exchange wool for oil, careful to measure the jars correctly. A child fetched water from a canal to mix with clay for bread, knowing that without grain from the fields there would be none. These simple acts, repeated endlessly, were the true substance of Lagash's economy. The canals themselves were as much part of trade as the marketplace. Dug with endless labor, maintained year after year, they carried water to fields and boats, to markets. A traveler could move from one end of the city's territory to another by following these waterways, seeing fields, groves, and villages pass slowly by. Along their banks, reeds swayed, birds nested, fishermen cast nets. The canals were arteries of both life and commerce, binding city and countryside together. To neglect them meant famine. To maintain them meant prosperity. Scribes, once again, stood at the heart of the system. They weighed barley on balances, measured oil in jars, counted sheep as they passed through gates. They pressed each figure into clay, their tablets becoming the ledger of Lagash. Without their records, trade would dissolve into confusion. With their records, each transaction was bound into the city's order. They were the silent accountants of an economy that stretched from farmer to king. Even festivals reflected the economic system. Offerings to the gods required goods drawn from the storehouses, sheep for sacrifice, grain for bread, oil for lamps. Each festival was both a spiritual act and an economic distribution, reminding the people that wealth flowed through temple and state alike. When statues of gods were carried in procession, when hymns were sung, when beer was poured, the goods of the land were transformed into symbols of devotion. Behind the rituals lay the unbroken cycle of production and exchange. At night, when the market stalls closed, the caravans rested, and the boats tied up along the canals, the city grew still. Families ate their evening bread, drank their beer, and slept beneath the stars. Yet, even in silence, the economy moved, for the jars in storehouses waited to be opened. The contracts in archives waited to be read. The goods in baskets waited to be carried away. Trade and exchange never truly ceased, only paused until dawn. The people of Lagash lived within this quiet web of movement. They may not have thought of themselves as part of a vast economy, yet their every act contributed to it. To sow seed, to weave cloth, to measure grain, to pour oil were acts within a system that reached from their hands to distant lands. The empire might rise and fall, but these rhythms endured. The city survived not through conquest, but through the steady persistence of trade, the silent cooperation of countless people doing their part. And so the economy of Lagash breathed, slow and steady, like the flow of its canals. Goods moved outward, goods returned, records were written, rations were given, lives were sustained. It was not dramatic, but it was essential. It was the quiet force that allowed the city to endure, carrying it forward through the centuries, weaving it into the greater fabric of Mesopotamia. In Lagash, the temples stood at the heart of both devotion and economy. their walls thick with the weight of centuries, their courtyards filled with the murmur of prayer, the shuffle of feet, and the steady business of offerings to walk near. One of these sanctuaries was to sense the overlap of sacred and practical life. The temple was not only a place of worship, but a storehouse, a workplace, an archive, and a gathering point. In its shadow, the people of Lagash lived and labored, their lives orbiting the divine as much as the empire. Every day began with offerings. Priests in linen garments moved quietly through the temple chambers, carrying bowls of grain, jars of beer, cuts of meat from freshly slaughtered animals. The statues of the gods, fashioned of wood and precious stones, were treated as living beings. They were washed, clothed, and fed. Hymns were chanted in the dim light, voices rising and falling slowly. To an outsider, the rituals might have seemed endless and repetitive, but to the people of Lagash, they were the rhythm of life itself. Without these daily acts, the gods might withdraw their favor, and the fragile balance of harvest and flood would collapse. The goods used in worship came directly from the economy. Sheep raised in temple flocks were slaughtered in courtyards, their blood spilling onto stone drains that carried it away. Barley measured in storehouses was baked into bread for offerings. Oil pressed from sesame seeds glowed in lamps during night rituals. Dates sweetened the meals of gods as they did those of men. Each object was both practical and sacred, drawn from the labor of the land and returned to the divine. The priests oversaw this cycle with care, ensuring that the offerings were regular, abundant, and properly recorded by scribes. Festivals brought these acts into larger scale. Several times a year, the temples organized great ceremonies that drew the entire city. Statues of the gods were lifted onto litters and carried in procession through the streets. Priests walked ahead, chanting, while musicians played slow and steady rhythms. Citizens followed, carrying offerings, lighting small lamps, or simply watching in reverent silence. The streets filled with color and movement, and for a time the ordinary pace of trade and labor was set aside. The gods themselves were believed to leave their sanctuaries and travel among the people, ensuring prosperity and protection. The festivals were also moments of redistribution. From the temple storehouses, large amounts of grain, beer, and meat were released. Workers and families received portions, feasting together under the open sky. What had been collected as tribute and offering was returned to the community, a cycle that reinforced both faith and loyalty. The gods gave back what was given to them, reminding the people that devotion and sustenance were bound together. 2. Eat bread distributed at a festival was not only to satisfy hunger, but to taste the blessing of the divine. The priests held immense influence, for they directed not only ritual but economy. Temples controlled large tracts of land, worked by laborers who plowed, sowed, and harvested for the gods. They managed flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, with shepherds tending animals across the plain. They supervised workshops where women wove wool into cloth destined for both trade and ritual. They employed scribes to track every jar of oil, every basket of grain, every shipment of reeds. The temple was a world within the world, its wealth rivaling that of kings, its influence touching every household dot. To serve as a priest was both an honor and a burden. Families dedicated their sons and daughters to temple service, offering them as musicians, attendants, or servants. Some remained for life, others only for a set number of years. Their duties were varied: sweeping floors, carrying water, singing hymns. To clean a temple courtyard was to aid in maintaining cosmic order. To pour oil into a lamp was to ensure that light never failed before the divine image. The Akkadian Empire did not erase these traditions, but folded them into its broader framework. Imperial authority recognized the power of temples, for their cooperation was necessary to maintain stability. Akkadian officials collected tribute, but they often allowed local priests to continue rituals in the old language, preserving Sumerian hymns and prayers. The blending of Akkadian administration with Sumerian devotion created a layered identity for Lagash. People prayed in words that echoed their ancestors, while paying taxes to kings who ruled in a new tongue. Both realities coexisted, and the temple was the place where they touched most clearly. The gods themselves were imagined in ways that reflected both continuity and change. Ninjutsu, the warrior god of Lagash, remained the protector of the city, honored with sacrifices and hymns. His consort Bo was revered as a goddess of healing and fertility. The Akkadian pantheon introduced new emphases, with deities like Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, gaining prominence. Yet in the temples of Lagash, the old gods still presided. Their statues, adorned with gold and lapis, stood in shadowed chambers, their gaze unchanging. People believed that these figures did not merely represent the gods, but embodied them. Harps, lyres, and flutes filled the courtyards with sound, soft and steady. Singers repeated lines of ancient hymns, their voices overlapping in measured tones. The effect was hypnotic, a slow chant that blurred the boundary between waking and dreaming. To sit in a temple courtyard, flickering and music rising, was to feel the city itself humming with devotion. The temple's role in justice was subtle but important. Oaths were often sworn before the gods, with offerings left as guarantees of honesty. Disputes might be settled in temple courts, where priests and scribes heard cases, consulting tablets and witnesses. A man who lied in such a setting risked divine punishment, not merely human judgment. Thus the temple stood not only as a place of worship, but as a guarantor of truth, anchoring the moral life of the community. Children grew up in this atmosphere of devotion. From their earliest days, they learned to bow before statues, to wash their hands before entering sanctuaries, to treat offerings with respect. They watched processions with wide eyes, their ears filled with chants, their noses with the scent of incense and roasted meat. For them, the gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences, who walked in the streets during festivals, and who listened in the quiet of the temple. This upbringing shaped their sense of the world, weaving faith into every thought and act. Even death was tied to temple life. Funerary rites involved offerings to the gods, prayers for the safe passage of the soul, and gifts left at family shrines. The dead were remembered in rituals performed at temple courtyards, linking ancestors to descendants, the past to the present. The people of Lagash believed that to neglect such rites invited misfortune, and the priests retreated to their quarters. The temples of Lagash stood silent. Their massive walls held the stored goods of the city. Their sanctuaries housed the statues of gods. Their archives preserved the words of scribes. The people slept in their homes, But the gods, it was believed, remained awake, watching over the city, accepting its offerings, sustaining its life. The temple, like the city itself, never truly rested in this way. The economy of Lagash and its spirituality were one and the same. To farm a field was to contribute to the temple. To weave cloth was to create offerings. To carry grain to a storehouse was to ensure that gods were fed and festivals could be held. Faith and labor were not separate spheres, but parts of a single cycle. The people of Lagash lived in that cycle as naturally as they breathed, their lives turning with the seasons, their devotion expressed in every act of work and worship. And so Lagash endured, a city where temples rose above the plains, where priests sang hymns in ancient tongues, where merchants traded goods carried from distant lands, and where the gods were believed to walk among men. The sacred and the practical were never divided. In the measured rituals of the temple and the steady labor of the fields, the people of Lagash found meaning, sustenance, and order. Even as empires shifted and rulers came and went, the gods of Lagash remained, and with them the quiet heartbeat of a city that survived through faith as much as through toil. The city of Lagash was more than temples and canals, more than kings and scribes. It was above all a place where families lived out their days, quietly shaping the rhythm of the city through ordinary acts. In narrow courtyards shaded with mats, children played with small clay figurines or chased one another among the dust. Women tended to grinding stones, kneeling on worn mats as they pushed heavy stone over grain, back and forth, the sound steady and endless. Men returned from the fields carrying tools on their shoulders, their clothes streaked with dust and sweat, their feet hardened from walking through soil and reeds. Life here unfolded slowly, predictably, and with few interruptions, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the measured cycle of harvests and festivals. Houses were made of mud brick, simple but sturdy, their walls rising in square shapes along narrow lanes. The bricks were formed from clay, mixed with straw, and baked hard by the heat of the sun. Roofs were flat, covered with reeds and earth, used as places to sleep on warm nights or to dry onions and fish in the sun. Windows were few and small, allowing little light inside, keeping the heat at bay. Inside, the rooms were cool, with floors packed hard from constant use. Most houses had a central space where family life gathered, with smaller rooms set aside for sleeping or storing jars. Courtyards were important, for they offered light, air, and a place for work. Women spun wool there, children played pots, were shaped, and meals prepared. Food was plain but nourishing, shaped by what the land and canals provided. Barley bread was the staple, baked daily in clay ovens shaped like domes. Women kneaded dough in large bowls, their hands sticky with flour and water, then pressed the bread against the hot walls of the oven. The smell filled the narrow streets, mingling with the sharper scent of fish drying on racks. Beer made from barley was the common drink, thick and slightly sour, often sipped through straws from large jars. Onions, leeks, garlic, and cucumbers added variety, their flavors strong and distinct. Dates were prized for their sweetness, eaten fresh or dried and stored in baskets. Fish from the canals and rivers provided protein, caught with nets or spears, salted and preserved for months. Meat from sheep or goats was rarer, reserved for special occasions or for those with wealth. Meals were not elaborate, but they were shared, eaten from common bowls, each family gathering around the food in quiet routine. Clothing was simple and functional, woven from wool sheared from sheep. Men wore skirts or kilts tied at the waist, leaving the upper body bare in the heat. Women wore longer garments, draped over the shoulders, belted at the waist, often with fringes along the edges. Children wore little in the hot months, running freely until they were older. Sandals were made from leather or reeds, though many walked barefoot through the dust. For special occasions, garments might be dyed with faint colors or decorated with simple patterns, but most clothing was plain, valued for durability over display. Jewelry existed, beads of shell, stone, or lapis, but it was not common, reserved for the wealthy or worn at festivals. The day began early. At dawn, men left their houses, carrying hoes, sickles, or baskets, walking along dusty paths toward fields. Women began grinding grain, fetching water, tending to children. The sound of animals filled the courtyards, goats bleating, donkeys braying, chickens clucking. Smoke rose from ovens as bread was baked for the day. Children fetched water in jars, balancing them on their shoulders, or gathered reeds from canal banks. By mid-morning, the lanes were filled with quiet activity. Potters shaped clay into jars, spinning their wheels slowly. Weavers stretched wool onto looms, their hands moving back and forth in steady rhythm. Fishermen returned with their catch, laying it out to dry. Merchants passed through, leading donkeys or carrying baskets. Life was busy but unhurried, each person repeating tasks passed down through generations. Education was not universal, but scribal schools existed near temples, where young boys, usually from wealthier families, learned to press signs into clay. They sat on mats, styluses in hand, copying lists of words or numbers, their teachers watching sternly. They learned the old Sumerian language, as well as Akkadian, mastering the shapes of cuneiform that preserved contracts, hymns, and laws. For most children, however, learning came from parents who taught them to farm, weave, or tend animals. Skills were passed on through practice rather than instruction, and childhood was short. By adolescence, boys joined their fathers in the fields or workshops. Girls helped their mothers at the hearth or loom. Marriage was arranged between families, with agreements marked on tablets and sealed by witnesses. A bride brought a dowry, often goods or livestock, while the groom's family promised support. Ceremonies were small, held in homes, with feasts shared among relatives. Families were large, with several generations living under one roof. The household was the core of life, providing stability, work, and identity. Elders were respected, their memory honored long after death, with small offerings placed at household shrines to maintain their presence among the living. The rhythms of the city were tied closely to the seasons. In spring, canals filled with water, fields were plowed, seeds sown. In summer, the heat was intense. Work carried out early in the day before the sun grew harsh. Autumn brought harvest, with fields alive, with workers cutting barley, gathering dates, threshing grain. Winter was quieter, with time for repairs, weaving, and storytelling by the hearth. Each season had its duties, predictable and enduring. Life was shaped by the turning of the year, not by sudden changes. The streets of Lagash were narrow, winding between mud-brick walls, filled with the smell of animals and smoke, the sound of voices calling out in Sumerian and Akkadian. Donkeys carried loads, goats wandered, dogs barked. At small, open spaces, markets formed, with baskets of grain, piles of onions, jars of oil, fish laid out on mats. People bargained quietly, inspected goods, exchanged rations or coins. Scribes sometimes sat at the edge, recording contracts, sealing tablets with cylinders. The market was never chaotic, but steady, a place where the ordinary needs of life were met. Evenings brought rest. Families gathered on rooftops or courtyards, sharing bread, sipping beer, speaking softly as the air cooled. Lamps of clay, filled with oil and a simple wick, flickered in the dusk. Children listened to stories told by elders, tales of gods and kings, of floods and battles, of heroes long past. Stars emerged above, bright in the wide Mesopotamian sky, unclouded by smoke or light. People lay down to sleep on mats, sometimes, outside to catch the night breeze. Dogs curled near doorways. Donkeys stood tethered. Goats settled in pens. The city fell quiet, its hum replaced by the steady sounds of insects, the occasional bark, the distant rush of water in canals. Dreams came easily in such rhythms, where each day resembled the one before, where life unfolded with small variations but few disruptions. Families woke, worked, ate, prayed, and slept, their lives woven into the fabric of the city as surely as bricks into walls. Kings ruled, scribes wrote, priests prayed, but the heartbeat of Lagash was in the courtyards, the fields, and the narrow lanes. It was in the grinding of grain, the baking of bread, the weaving of wool, the tending of animals. It was in the quiet endurance of countless ordinary lives, lived steadily beneath the gaze of gods and the rule of empire. And so Lagash endured not only as a city of temples and kings, but as a place of homes and families. Its true history was not written only in stone inscriptions or royal decrees, but in the silent labor of women at grinding stones, in the play of children with clay toys, in the patient work of farmers guiding water into fields. This was the world that sustained the city, the world that gave meaning to its monuments, the world that continued long after rulers had passed. In the city of Lagash, life was not only measured in fields and harvests, but also in the slow, steady work of craftsmen who shaped the objects that filled homes, temples, and markets. The narrow lanes of the city often opened into courtyards, where the air was heavy with dust, clay, and the smell of smoke from small kiln. Each craft had its rhythm, each workshop its sound, and together they created the hum of a city that worked quietly to sustain itself. The potter's craft was among the most important. Clay lay in abundance along the riverbanks, soft and pliable, easily dug by hand or gathered in baskets. In shaded courtyards, potters kneaded the clay, pressing it again and again to remove stones and air. Their hands moved with practiced slowness, shaping the clay on wheels that turned with a steady rhythm, pushed by foot or hand. A lump of earth became a jar, a bowl, or a pitcher, walls rising evenly as the potter's fingers pressed and smoothed. Once shaped, the vessels dried in the sun, lined neatly in rows, their surfaces pale and soft. Later, they were placed in kilns, heated with reeds and wood, hardening into forms that could endure years of use. Each vessel was simple, unadorned, made for utility rather than beauty, though sometimes incised with faint patterns or marks that caught the light. In every household, such jars held water, oil, grain, or beer. Silent companions to daily life, weaving was another constant craft, most often carried out by women, though workshops sometimes gathered larger groups. Sheep provided wool in spring and washed in canals. The fibers were carded, spun into thread with spindles, and gathered into balls. Looms stood in courtyards or in long workrooms, upright frames where threads hung in parallel lines. Women passed shuttles back and forth, their hands moving in steady rhythm, beating the threads into place with wooden combs. The fabric grew, slowly, line by line, soft and strong, destined to be cut and sewn into clothing or traded in markets. The sound of weaving was quiet but steady, a soft clatter of wood and fiber that filled the hours. Wool was the most common material, but flax also grew in the fields, and linen cloth was valued for its lightness in the heat. The colors were simple, often undyed, though plants and minerals sometimes provided faint hues. Cloth was precious, representing hours of work, and it moved easily across trade routes as one of the city's most valued goods. Metalwork was more specialized, for metals were not abundant in the plain. Copper came from distant lands, carried along trade routes, exchanged for wool or grain. In workshops, smiths heated the metal in small furnaces, the glow of fire bright against the dusk. They poured molten copper into molds, shaping tools, blades, or small ornaments. The air filled with the sharp scent of smoke and hot metal, the ringing of hammers against stone or anvil. The tools they produced were simple but essential: axes for cutting wood, chisels for shaping stone, sickles for harvesting grain. Some pieces were adorned with small designs, not only functional but pleasing to the eye. Wealthier families or temples sometimes commissioned jewelry or ceremonial objects, beads of copper or silver, or fittings for statues of the gods. These works were rare but enduring, lasting centuries if cared for. Stone carving was another craft, though stone itself was scarce in the alluvial plain. Blocks were brought from quarries far away, transported along rivers, or dragged across the land. Carvers worked slowly with chisels, shaping statues, reliefs, or foundation stones for temples. In Lagash, as in other Sumerian cities, statues of rulers were placed in sanctuaries, their faces calm, hands folded in prayer. These figures were not portraits in the modern sense, but symbols of devotion, eternal substitutes for the living, who could stand perpetually before the gods. The work of the carver was patient and deliberate, each stroke of the tool removing fragments to reveal form. Smaller objects, such as cylinder seals, were carved with intricate detail. These seals, rolled across wet clay, left repeating patterns of animals, gods, or geometric designs. Every scribe, every merchant carried one, using it to mark ownership or to seal contracts. The making of such seals required both skill and concentration, for the designs were tiny but precise, meant to last for generations. Boat building, too, was essential in a city bound together by water. The rivers and canals were the lifelines of Lagash, and boats carried goods, people, and animals. Wood was scarce, imported from distant mountains, but reeds grew in abundance along the waterways. With reeds bundled and lashed together, craftsmen shaped light boats that floated easily, moving silently along canals. For heavier loads, wooden boats were built, their planks joined with bitumen to seal seams against leaks. In workshops near the water's edge, the smell of tar and wood filled the air as men bent over frames, hammering, lashing, caulking. The boats they produced carried grain to market, fish from river to home, and goods along trade routes that stretched far beyond the city. Workshops of craftsmen often stood close together, forming clusters where noise and activity blended. The thump of the potter's wheel, the ring of the smith's hammer, the rhythm of the weaver's shuttle, the smell of baking clay, hot metal, or woven wool all mingled in narrow streets. Children ran errands, carrying water or clay, watching their parents at work, learning slowly through observations. Skills were rarely written down, but passed from hand to hand, from elder to younger, in a chain of memory that reached back through generations. To master a craft was to enter into this chain, to become part of a living tradition that stretched as long as the city itself. The temple often played a role in these crafts, commissioning goods, employing workers, and distributing finished items. Pottery was made for offerings, jars for storing temple grain, fabrics for dressing statues, tools for maintaining fields. Craftsmen worked under contract, their names recorded by scribes, their deliveries noted on tablets. Payment might be made in rations of grain, oil, or beer rather than coin, each craftsman sustained by the products of the land. Some workshops were independent, selling directly in markets, while others were tied closely to temple or palace, their labor directed toward the needs of rulers and gods. Markets displayed the fruits of this labor. In open spaces, mats were spread, with rows of pottery, baskets of woven reeds, bundles of wool, jars of oil, copper tools, and carved seals. Shoppers walked slowly, touching, testing, speaking softly with sellers. Bargains were struck not in haste, but in calm negotiation, overseen at times by scribes who wrote agreements on clay. Every object carried with it hours of labor, whether in the heat of the kiln, the smoke of the furnace, or the steady patience of the loom. To purchase such goods was to share in that labor, to bring into the household a piece of the city's quiet industry. Artisans took pride in their work, though pride was measured not in display but in durability. A pot that held water without cracking, a fabric that endured through seasons, a tool that cut efficiently, a seal that left its impression clearly. These were the marks of success. Beauty was present, but quietly, in the curve of a jar, the rhythm of woven lines, the glint of polished stone. The city did not seek grandeur in its everyday objects, but reliability, for these were the things that sustained life day after day. In the evening, when workshops grew quiet, tools laid aside, fires dimmed, and wheels stilled, the objects remained. Jars cooled in kilns, fabrics hung on looms, boats rested on the banks, metal cooled in molds. The city slept, but its crafts endured, waiting to be carried into homes, temples, and markets. The silent presence of these objects spoke of countless hours of labor, steady and repetitive, each act small but essential. The life of craftsmen was not dramatic, but it was vital. Without their labor, the city could not eat, drink, trade or prey. Their hands shaped the vessels that held water, the cloth that clothed bodies, the seals that guaranteed contracts, the boats that moved goods, the tools that cut harvests. Their work was everywhere, though their names were rarely remembered. In their quiet workshops, they sustained the life of Lagash as surely as farmers in fields or priests in temples, and so the city endured, not only through kings and temples, but through the patience of artisans who shaped clay, wool, wood, and metal into the simple forms of daily life. Their work was ordinary, their rhythm steady, their presence constant. In the long history of Lagash, it was these countless acts of craftsmanship, repeated generation after generation, that gave the city its texture, its utility, and its quiet strength. Trade was the quiet thread that tied Lagash to the wider world. Though the city rose on the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, surrounded by canals, fields, and villages, it was never isolated. Along its narrow streets and through its busy markets moved the goods of distant lands, carried by merchants who walked for weeks or floated for days to bring back what the plain itself could not provide. The heart of Lagash was self-sufficient in food. Barley grew in abundance, and dates hung heavy on their stems. Onions, garlic, and cucumbers thrived in gardens, while fish filled the canals. But the land was poor in certain things. There was little wood, little stone, little metal. These must come from elsewhere, from mountains, deserts, or seas far away. To obtain them, Lagash turned to trade. Each morning, in the open spaces between houses, merchants set up small stalls. Mats were laid on the ground, jars arranged neatly, baskets opened to show their contents. Locals brought their surplus, wool spun into bundles, barley in sacks, dried fish, salt, and oil. These were exchanged. 4 items harder to find, stones polished into beads, metals hammered into tools, timber cut into planks. The market was not noisy or chaotic, but steady, filled with the murmur of voices as buyers and sellers spoke softly, weighing goods by hand, testing fabric between fingers, tasting grain for quality. Some merchants remained within the city, trading what local craftsmen and farmers produced. Others traveled farther, carrying donkeys laden with goods along dusty roads. To the north, caravans reached the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, where copper and tin were mined. To the east, they found the Iranian plateau, where stone metals and rare woods could be obtained. To the south, merchants followed the rivers to the marshes near the Persian Gulf, where trade ships arrived with goods from Arabia, Dilmun, and beyond. These routes stretched far, reaching lands few in Lagash would ever see, but whose presence was felt in every bead of lapis, every tool of copper, every jar of resin that entered the city. Waterways were the easiest paths of trade. The Tigris and Euphrates, and the smaller canals that branched from them, served as living highways. Boats of reed or wood carried heavy loads more easily than donkeys could on land. A single boat, guided by a few men, could bring back tons of grain or timber or jars of oil. Along the banks, men pulled the boats with ropes, leaning into the effort, their steps steady, their pace slow but enduring. Others pulled the boats through shallow water, their bodies bent against the weight. By water, the goods of Lagash reached distant markets, and distant goods came home. Among the most valued imports was timber. The flat plains of Sumer yielded only reeds and palms, useful but limited, for sturdy beams, for boat frames, for fine furniture. The people of Lagash relied on wood from distant mountains. From the north came cedar, tall and straight, fragrant with resin. From the east came hardwoods, carried by caravan or raft. To see such timber arrive in the city was to witness a luxury, for each beam had been carried across hundreds of kilometers, through deserts, rivers, and passes. In the hands of craftsmen, it became doors, boats, or temple beams, objects that stood for generations. Metals, too, were rare and precious. Copper came from Oman and Iran, tin from Anatolia, or farther still, brought together to make bronze. The smiths of Lagash heated and hammered these metals, turning them into tools, weapons, and ornaments. A small piece of copper represented weeks of travel, careful exchange, and long negotiation. Gold and silver appeared as well, not in great quantities, but in enough to make small ornaments or to gild statues of the gods. These metals were signs of wealth, their gleam catching the lamplight in temples and homes. From the land of Dilmun, from the east came carnelian and lapis lazuli, stones of deep red and brilliant blue, polished into beads and inlays. Lapis, especially, was prized for its vivid color, unlike anything in the plains. To wear a bead of lapis was to carry with you a fragment of mountains far away, a trace of a distant world. Such stones were not only ornaments, but symbols of connection, proof that Lagash was part of something larger, a web of exchange that spanned lands and seas. Trade was not only for luxury. Everyday goods moved constantly. Salt from marshes, bitumen for sealing boats, reeds for mats, and baskets all passed through hands in the markets. Grain itself became a form of currency, measured in jars and sacks, traded for tools or labor. Beer and oil were rationed, distributed in fixed amounts, sometimes used in exchange for services. The scribes recorded these transactions on tablets, marking with wedges the quantity, the name, the date. A sealed tablet could serve as a contract, guaranteeing that an agreement would be upheld. In this way, trade was not merely physical, but also written, bound by law and memory. The merchants themselves lived lives of constant movement. Some remained within the city, maintaining stalls and warehouses. Others left for weeks at a time, traveling with caravans, sleeping in the open, cooking over small fires, guarding their goods against thieves or storms. They returned with donkeys laden with sacks, their faces lined from sun and wind, bringing stories of distant lands, of deserts where caravans stretched endlessly, of harbors where ships from far lands gathered. These stories spread in quiet evenings, shared in courtyards, filling the imagination of those who had never left the plain. Markets in Lagash reflected this distant movement. On one mat, a potter sold his jars, plain and practical. Next to him, a merchant displayed beads of stone or glass, each glinting in the sun. Another offered timber cut into planks, the smell of cedar strong in the air. A scribe sat nearby, stylus ready, inscribing deals into clay. The market was not loud but steady, each exchange carried out in quiet order. A child tugged at her mother's hand, staring at a lapis bead. A farmer counted out grain in baskets, weighing carefully before handing it over. A craftsman examined a tool, running his hand along the metal edge before nodding and paying. Each act was simple, but together they created the lifeblood of the city. The temple often guided this trade, acting as a central hub. Goods flowed into temple storerooms, grain from the fields, wool from herds, fish from rivers. From these stores, the temple directed trade, sending caravans out, receiving imports in return, directed toward the needs of gods and rulers. Yet ordinary people also benefited, for goods circulated outward again, reaching households through markets, wages, and rations. Trade shaped not only material life, but imagination. To hold a bead of lapis was to know of mountains in the east. To smell cedar was to think of forests never seen. To touch copper was to feel the weight of lands beyond the desert. These objects were not only useful, but reminders that Lagash was part of a larger world, a world bound together not by conquest, but by exchange. In the quiet evenings, when the market stalls were packed away, the goods remained in homes, silent witnesses of journeys. A jar of oil, a plank of wood, a bead of stone all spoke of distant lands, of merchants who walked for days, of boats that floated for weeks, of scribes who recorded agreements long forgotten. They carried within them the memory of movement, the echo of trade that linked the city to the world beyond. Thus, Lagash endured not only as a city of temples, fields, and workshops, but as a city of trade, tied by invisible threads to mountains, deserts, and seas. Its markets were quiet, its exchanges steady, but through them passed the goods and stories of distant places. Each jar, each bead, each plank was part of this story, connecting ordinary lives to lands far away. In the rhythm of trade, as in the rhythm of farming and craft, the city found its continuity, its place in a wider world, its quiet endurance across generations. The city of Lagash was more than houses, fields, and markets. At its heart stood the temples, raised above the low plain on platforms of brick, their walls thick and heavy, their courtyards quiet. These temples were not only places of worship, but centers of life, gathering stores of food, directing labor, and shaping the rhythm of the city. Religion was not separate from daily existence, but woven into every act, from the plowing of fields to the sealing of contracts, from the weaving of cloth to the building of boats. In the early morning, before the sun rose high, priests entered the courtyards of the temples. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft on baked earth. Within the sanctuaries, fires were kindled, lamps lit, and incense placed to burn, the smoke rising in thin lines toward the beams above. Statues of the gods stood within, carved of stone or molded of clay, clothed in garments woven by temple weavers, adorned with ornaments given in offering. To the people of Lagash, these statues were not mere images, but the presence of the divine itself, seated in the heart of the city. Each day began with offerings, bread baked from barley, jars of beer, baskets of dates, cuts of meat, and vessels of oil were laid before the gods. The food was real, drawn from fields, flocks, and herds, carried in by workers, recorded by scribes. The offerings were consumed not by mouths, but by ritual, the essence believed to be taken by the gods, while the remainder was distributed among priests, workers, or stored for later use. In this way, the gods were fed, and the people were sustained. A cycle that bound the divine and human together in quiet reciprocity. The priests moved with calm precision. Some prepared food, others poured libations of water or beer onto the ground, speaking soft words as they did so. Others maintained the lamps, trimming wicks, refilling oil so that light never ceased before the statues. Musicians sometimes played, soft notes on lyres or flutes, their melodies rising and falling with slow repetition, lulling as much as exalting. The rituals were not loud or dramatic, but steady, measured, repeating day after day, season after season. Temples were also places of record. Scribes sat in shaded rooms, clay tablets before them, styluses in hand. They wrote lists of offerings, tallies of grain, names of workers, contracts of exchange. Each wedge pressed into clay carried meaning, each tablet stored in shells or jars within the temple's walls. To worship the gods was also to keep accounts, to ensure that what was promised was delivered, that what was given was remembered. The temple was not only sacred, but administrative, guiding the flow of goods as much as the flow of prayers. Festivals marked the calendar, moments when the city gathered more fully. On these days, sanctuaries placed on platforms and paraded through streets. Crowds watched in silence or sang hymns, their voices blending in low chant. Offerings were greater, feasts prepared, and lamps lit in greater number. Music filled the air, drums and pipes sounding steadily, marking the pace of processions. Such festivals broke the routine, but even they followed patterns, repeated year after year, their meaning rooted in cycles of planting, harvest, or celestial movement. The great temple of Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, was the most important. Ningirsu was a god of agriculture and war, of strength and fertility, protector of the city and its fields. His temple stood as a symbol of Lagash's devotion, built and rebuilt across centuries, its walls repaired, its bricks renewed, its storerooms filled with the goods of land and labor. Priests of Ningirsu guided not only worship but governance, for the temple's wealth was vast, its influence reaching across the city's life. Other temples honored deities of water, grain, and fertility, each with their own rituals, but together they formed a network of devotion that tied the city to the divine. Ordinary people participated in this life in simple ways. A farmer might bring a basket of barley as offering, a fisherman a portion of his catch, a weaver a length of cloth. These gifts were modest, but each was meaningful, binding the giver to the god. Families visited temples on holy days, standing quietly before statues, bowing their heads, whispering prayers for health, fertility, or protection. The act of offering was not grand but steady, repeated across lives, a rhythm as constant as the river or the harvest. The temple complexes were not only sacred but living places. Courtyards filled with workers, granaries stored grain in tall bins, herds of sheep or goats were kept in pens. Workshops produced goods for temple use. The smell of baking bread mixed with the smoke of incense, the bleating of animals with the chanting of priests. The boundary between sacred and ordinary was not sharp. To serve the temple was to serve both God and city, and in this way religion touched every aspect of life. Even architecture carried this presence. The ziggurat, a stepped platform built of brick, rose above the city. its mass visible from fields beyond. Its height was not only practical, but symbolic, a bridge between earth and sky, a place where humans could approach the divine more closely. Climbing its steps was an act of devotion, a slow ascent that mirrored the rising of prayers. From its summit, the city spread outward in all directions, canals glinting in the light, fields stretching to the horizon. To stand there was to feel the scale of Lagash, its life bound together beneath the gaze of the gods. The rhythm of religious life shaped time itself. Days were marked by offerings, seasons by festivals, years by the rebuilding of walls or renewal of statues. The gods were eternal, their presence unchanging, and the people of Lagash aligned their lives to this constancy. The city might face floods, droughts, or wars, but the temples endured, their rituals continuing, their lamps burning. In the steady repetition of worship, people found assurance, a sense that life, though fragile, was held within a larger order. At night, when the city grew quiet, the temples remained awake. Lamps flickered in sanctuaries, shadows moving gently on walls. The statues of the gods stood silent, clothed, adorned, unmoving yet present. Outside, the courtyards lay in darkness, the air still. The river flowed softly beyond, unseen but heard, its murmur like a hymn. Within the temple walls, the calm presence of the divine remained, a quiet center around which the city turned in this way. Lagash lived not only by its fields and markets, but by its temples, the steady heart of its existence. The gods were honored, each day fed, clothed, and remembered. Priests tended lamps and offerings. Scribes recorded transactions. Workers carried grain and oil. Festivals lifted spirits. Processions filled streets. Hymns rose into the air. But beneath all this was a steady, enduring rhythm, a calm repetition that bound human life to divine presence. It was this rhythm that gave the city its shape, its assurance, its quiet strength across generations. And so the temples of Lagash, with their heavy walls, their courtyards, their sanctuaries, and their ziggurats, stood not only as buildings, but as the very center of the city's soul. Within them the gods dwelled, and through them the people lived, their lives measured not only by harvests and markets, but by prayers and offerings, by lamps that never ceased to burn, by rituals that never ceased to repeat. Time in Mesopotamia was measured not only by harvests and floods, but by the rise and fall of cities. No city endured unchanged, and Lagash, for all its temples and fields, for all its careful canals and quiet rituals, was no exception. To the people who walked its streets, life seemed steady, its rhythms endless. The offerings continued each day, the markets opened, the scribes recorded, the farmers tilled. Yet beyond the horizon forces gathered that would alter the fate of the plain, and the city that had once been central would slowly begin to fade. The first challenges came not from within, but from the shifting balance of power among neighboring cities. Lagash had long struggled with Amma over the Guidana, and though victories had been won, though monuments like the stele of the vultures told of triumph, the struggle never fully ended. Each new ruler of Umma sought to reclaim the fields, and each new ruler of Lagash defended them in turn. These conflicts drained resources, consumed energy, and kept the city always prepared for war. Over time, such tension eroded strength. Beyond the rivalry of neighbors lay an even greater change. North of Sumer, in the land of Acd, new powers began to rise. Chief among them was Sargon, a man whose name would be remembered long after Lagash was a memory. Sargon built an empire that stretched farther than any before, uniting cities that had once been rivals under a single rule. Lagash, like others, found itself drawn into this larger structure. Its Ensi was no longer fully sovereign, but served within the framework of Akkadian power. The city still stood, its temples still functioned, its people still worked their fields, but independence was gone, absorbed into something greater. The Akkadian period brought both continuity and change. The gods of Lagash were still honored, the canals still maintained, the markets still active, yet the center of power shifted northward, away from the quiet plain. The scribes of Lagash still pressed signs into clay, but often their records now mentioned Akkadian officials, Akkadian governors, Akkadian kings. The city became part of an empire whose scale dwarfed its own traditions. What had once been the center was now a province, a region, a point within a wider map. In time, the Akkadian Empire itself faltered. Droughts struck, invasions pressed in, and order broke down. Cities rebelled, trade routes shifted, and Sargon's descendants struggled to maintain what had been built. In this moment of upheaval, Lagash again found a place of prominence. Local rulers asserted themselves, and for a brief time the city rose once more as a significant power. The ruler Gudea, remembered in statues of calm poise, governed Lagash with wisdom and devotion. His reign was marked not by conquest but by building, by the expansion of temples, by the dedication of monuments to the gods. Gudea's statues show him seated or standing, hands clasped, features composed garments, detailed with care. On their surfaces, inscriptions describe his works: canals dug, temples raised, offerings made. These statues, scattered now across museums of the modern world, carry forward his presence, a reminder of the time when Lagash briefly returned to prominence under his steady hand. For the people of Lagash, his reign must have seemed a renewal, a quiet flourishing after years of struggle. Yet even this revival could not last. New powers gathered, this time from yore, where the third dynasty rose to dominance. The kings of yore, with their administrative skill and military might, built an empire that again encompassed the whole of Sumer and beyond. Lagash became part of this realm, valued for its fields and canals, for its temples and workers, but no longer a sovereign center. Its rulers were governors, its autonomy limited. The rhythm of life continued, but the city was now woven into the fabric of something larger. Its individuality softened, slowly, over generations. The prominence of Lagash faded. Other cities, Roseyor, Uruk, Babylonand, the name of Lagash was spoken less often. Its temples still stood, but repairs came less frequently, their bricks weathered by wind and rain. Farmers still worked the fields, but their grain was tallied not in the name of Lagash's rulers, but in that of foreign kings. The city did not vanish in a single moment, but declined slowly, absorbed into the long ebb and flow of Mesopotamian history. For the people who lived their life remained steady. They still rose with the sun, tended fields, baked bread, poured offerings. Children still played in courtyards, Animals still bleated in pens. Scribes still pressed signs into clay. To them, the city was alive, as it had always been. Yet from the view of history, the center had shifted, the influence diminished. The greatness transformed into memory. What endured were traces, statues of rulers like Gudaya, inscriptions on tablets, fragments of monuments. These objects carried forward the names and deeds of Lagash, even as the city itself diminished. In later centuries, when scribes wrote histories or kings recited lineages, the name of Lagash appeared as part of the ancient past. A place once powerful, once central, now remembered in stone and clay. The decline of Lagash was not unique, but part of a pattern. In Mesopotamia, cities rose and fell, one after another, each leaving behind layers of ruins, each remembered in tablets or hymns. The land itself endured. The rivers continued to flood and recede. The fields continued to yield barley. But the names of rulers shifted. The centers of power moved. Lagash had its time, long and significant. But, like all cities, it gave way to others. Today, the ruins of Lagash lie quiet on the plain, their bricks worn, their walls fallen. Archaeologists uncover fragments of its past, tablets inscribed with lists and prayers, statues carved with inscriptions, remains of temples and canals. From these traces, the life of the city can be reconstructed, its rhythms glimpsed across millennia. The sound of reed boats on canals, the murmur of markets, the chants of priests, the steady scratching of styluses into clay, all can be imagined in the stillness of the ruins to fall asleep thinking of. Lagash is to drift into this long rhythm, a city that once thrived, that once fed its gods and fought its neighbors, that once built temples and dug canals, that once rose to prominence and then faded. Its life was steady, its decline slow, its memory enduring. It reminds us that history is not only of empires and conquests, but of quiet cities, of ordinary people, of rhythms repeated day after day, year after year. In their steadiness lies a kind of greatness, a persistence that outlasts the names of rulers, that continues in the silent bricks of ruins, in the fragments of clay, in the memory of the plain. And so Lagash, though fallen, remains, not as a living city, but as a story, a memory, a part of the long unfolding of human life on the Mesopotamian plain.